You're listening to Ricochet live on the air. This is the audiobook of Ricochet, Cultural Epigenetics and the Philosophy of Change, read by the author myself, Alex Head. The program is going to run continuously, in fact, pretty much for as long as it takes, every first and third Wednesday of the month. And it's going to be running at 1 p.m. till 2 p.m. And then new episode will air later that night, so tonight, between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. And there'll also be some other rhythms which you can kind of listen out for during the overall program. So if you hear... then that means that it's the beginning of a new chapter. And if you hear then that means that we've arrived at the end of today's session. And then there's one last sound, which is if you hear a little bit like a damp squib, but if you hear this sound, that means that I'm going to be adding some new content, which is not actually in the book, because, for example, there are a great many illustrations and images throughout the project. So I'm going to be doing some descriptions of those. And I guess because the full title of the book is Ricochet, Cultural Epigenetics and the Philosophy of Change, I felt that it would make sense to bear witness to history as a kind of plastic, best projection of events rather than kind of eternally fixed in stone. So I will try to elaborate once in a while if I feel that there's some new content to add to the book. For example, I wrote this new project description just for the audiobook. Ricochet, Cultural Epigenetics and the Philosophy of Change, on Lejar Forlag. Epigenetics is the science of epi, in brackets above, tags sitting on our genes, like gargoyles on a church facade. These little chemical groupings influence which cells are reproduced during cell division and replication. In direct relationship to external factors such as diet and stress. The epigenome are like a series of cellular scale app notifications that nudge the cell to respond in a specific way. And because culture always communicates political and emotional information, causing stress or relief, or both, one can in fact speak non-theoretically of culturally influenced epigenetic activation and silencing in real biological bodies. In Ricochet, the artist explores a recurrent 12,000-year history of the sacred date palm tree. Culturally mutating from Iran and Syria via ancient and modern Greece, all the way to the rear of the German Secret Service building, or BND, in Berlin and beyond. Along the way, he models the now current takeover of the United States by white supremacist corporate fascism. He uses cell biology to explore radio curation and broadcasting, and the power of words themselves to alter our interior physiology. He makes his debut proposal of cultural epigenetics in the field of comparative cultural anthropology, and he continues to work with this idea today. Indeed, the study of causation between our environment and the genes we humans pass on to the next generation through epigenetic tags is still very young. However, abusive or otherwise toxic environments during childhood have been shown to affect a person's cell behaviour, with consequences in later life. And it is epigenetic silencing or activation that carries that abuse into the body's cells. Culture, it is argued, alters not only our minds, but the very bodies in which we live. It's important to note that the work of cultural epigenetics developed here argues for the determination of human biology by culture and not the other way around. That cultural expressions can be shown to replicate in cyclical patterns over time does not mean that they are inevitable. Introduction. The lungs of history had contracted. A new breath, out of which new life would evolve, had already begun to fill the researcher's chest. Her diaphragm contracted as she turned, belched, and returned to the task of gathering for the coming era. This book is about a long process of human cultural evolution, from circa (c) 30,000 years before the Common Era (BCE), to the year 2021 and beyond. I argue that along this journey, epigenetics and mutation have been overlooked as essential components within the formation of how humans have come to conceive of themselves within this universe. I posit that epigenetic processes of activation and silencing especially offer templates for cultural, political, and spiritual adaptation in an age of apocalypse. I use the term apocalypse not to insinuate the popularized image of a cataclysmic end of times, but in the original Greek meaning of revelation, from apo, meaning un, and kaputulian, meaning to cover. It has been a great privilege to have the time and resources with which to delve into the mythology, the historical records, and the biological, philosophical, and political material that underpins the ideas gathered in this work. At the root of this project is a concern that the conditions which led to fascism prior to the Second World War are seeping back into mainstream politics. For almost a century, the fanatic genocidal program of Nazi, quote, applied biology, unquote, has haunted the scientist and the philosopher who would attempt to draw upon biological analogies in their work, and rightly so. Scientific observations do not include ethical guidelines in and of themselves. Today, the decolonial project to unseat white Western cultural imperialism and cultural hegemony demonstrates that it is not only biology, but actually any other field of knowledge that can and has in the past, been used to justify ideological concepts of racial and cultural supremacy. Colonial projects are always tied to markets, brackets, from enslaved persons to palm oil to diamonds, close brackets, and huge networks of enabling institutions. From the architecture of ancient Greece, stripped of its flamboyant colours during the process of constructing neoclassical whiteness. Footnote 1. It is now established that the idea that Greek sculpture was white, quote, does not hold true thanks to the findings of laboratory research that demonstrates the extensive use of colour in sculpture. Words in reference to the simplicity of ancient Greek sculptures, which came from the circle of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, ultimately contributed to the articulation of the theory concerning the ideal whiteness of ancient statues, occupying the position of Platonic archetypes that would have lost their geometric perfection had they received colouring. Unquote. Olga Palaya, Handbook of Greek Sculpture, 2019. To the botany and etymology which brought African palm weevils from West Africa to Malaysia, footnote 2. Indonesia and Malaysia make up 85% of all palm oil production. Quote, the oil palm trees actually originated in West Africa and were introduced to Malaysia by British colonizers in 1875. In 1981, African palm weevils were introduced to the country. And palm oil yields boomed as weevils pollinate palm trees very efficiently. Unquote. Why palm oil is so cheap. Business Insider, 2019. Enhancing a new era of enslaved labour in order to create over half of the consumer products in the West. So I just wanted to add here that this project is going to look at a lot of material history, right? So it's going to bring in particular material examples of how certain products and raw materials are traded, and kind of how that relates to the way that we have shaped the world around us and we've shaped the human relations between people. And it's going to look at the way in which those human relations have involved a lot of trauma. And so it's going to try and make an argument that the way in which we treat the world, the way in which we treat each other, all of those become, as it were, written into the archive of the human body itself. So the human body is the kind of archive of all the things that have happened to it, and indeed that includes the things that have happened to it down the generations. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at this particular motif of the palm tree, because it's a visual motif which you can find over this 12,000 year history that we're going to get into for the next several months. But what I wanted to make sure is clear is that there are lots of different types of palm tree. And the ones which I'm going to talk about are the date palms, the sacred date palms, which are, very, very significant mystical symbols. But there are also, of course, other types of palm production which have dominated colonial life, and indeed now the kind of mass production of palm oil into, as I say here, half of the consumer products in the West. So I just wanted to make sure that that distinction is clear between palm oil and the sacred date palm tree. Okay, going back into the text now. I contend that it is time to explore our anxieties concerning biological models of cultural evolution as a means of acknowledging the ridiculousness of, quote, race science, unquote, in the first place. The ideology of Nazi Germany should not be feared on an intellectual level. That ideology seeks to draw its power from a systematic suppression of knowledge. It is pure idealism of the worst and most destructive variety, and while I have not set out to create a decolonial text, I hope that the following cultural historical work can be of some use to the ongoing process of decolonizing the human mind. Decolonization as a cultural and philosophical movement, brackets, as well as its other political and material consequences, close brackets, requires me to become accountable for the Western capitalist ideal of infinite growth and the material products of that ideal upon the so-called global South. In this sense, it answers critics of the progressive left who claim that no new visionary idea is forthcoming in our age of revelation and turmoil. The visionary ideas are there, regardless of the centrists and liberals who cannot or will not recognize their revolutionary potential. In some respects, I am, of course, deeply anxious about creating a work which draws on biological models, especially where they discuss the history of human culture. Some crucial distinctions are, however, to be recognized. Nowhere will the reader find ideas themselves discussed biologically. Rather, the ways in which an idea's expression has changed will be discussed in the terms of evolution and stasis. Nothing in my work presents ideas as natural or unnatural, and clearly nowhere will the reader find peoples described in biological terms, but rather the mechanisms that come to determine how peoples interact culturally and politically. At times, this approach may demand an unusual degree of concentration from the reader. This is because accounting for both the material realities of the world, in brackets, biology among them, close brackets, and the idealist experience of the world in abstract thought can be difficult. To me, a decolonial approach is crucial to any assessment of the sorry state of affairs the world often appears to find itself in today. Yes, distinguishing between materiality and idealism can be a messy business. But life is messy, and although the world is divided across so many of the key issues that will determine the fates of our collective future, that also means there is a lot to fight for. I believe that you and I need material philosophy now more than ever. Contemporary pioneers of this art form, from Hannah Arendt to Donna Haraway and Manuel de Landa, make, in my view, a most profound sense of the chaos and destruction humans demand of their environment. These authors, and a number of others, on whose work I shall draw, place the reader within their own skin and prepare us to deal with the most pressing issue of our age, human superfluity. At the end of my research phase, which is to say at the outset of writing per se, I was fixated upon cultural expressions of cycles of life, death, and regeneration in the earliest known religions and mythologies. I had intended to establish a pattern of physical and political enclosures, followed by a history of their transgression and the identification of the transgressors as deviants. However, the work has been obliged to pivot. Shortly after I began writing, in January 2020, the global pandemic began. Itself the product of a mutation in the virus known as Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-19, which, as we know, causes COVID-19. Clearly, these circumstances have affected my ongoing research into mutation, which, however, predates the situation at the time of print by 4 years. With or without the current pandemic, there has always been an urgency to enhancing the scope for human adaptability. However, human spontaneity, adaptability, and creativity are only enhanced through public presentation and critical feedback around a given problem. This is finally why we have to keep writing, sculpting, dancing, singing, and all the rest, in public, whatever that might mean in tomorrow's world. In 2017, after the inauguration of the 45th United States President, I had an inclination that the intersection of technology and right-wing politics had reached a particular crystallization in its contemporary development. As someone indoctrinated into the world of conspiracy theorist Alex Jones in my early 20s, before I knew better, and before I recognized the far right-wing slant, the power grab of 45 was both shocking and tragically predictable. It was like watching all the worst aspects of the 20th century play out in slow motion, and it still is. The controversies around the events of September 11th, to which Alex Jones and myself had dedicated so much time, served to disenfranchise not only a political party, but the very idea of US government at all. This tragedy rocked US politics to such a degree that running on an anti-elite platform had actually worked. Perhaps it was the traditional, quote, white lash of voters punishing themselves for the slightest step toward progressive politics. It is far more likely, however, that self-appointed media platforms such as Jones's had successfully mobilized frightened voters to vote in accordance with the resurgent Islamophobia coupled with resurgent anti-Semitism in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. As Barnaby Raine wrote in the winter of 2020, quote, "If Islamophobia is political culturalism fitted to anxieties about security, anti-Semitism is political culturalism fitted to economic anxieties. The left needs to take this seriously as a predictable ideological product of our moment, understanding that taking it seriously, including where it appears in our own ranks, just as other bigotries can, means being true to our principles and not betraying them. It exists, and the answer is more radicalism, not less." Barnaby Raine, Jewphobia Now, in Salvage, That was a repeated publication in April of 2021. Following sustained attacks on the anti-racist left in Great Britain, brackets in which anti-Semitism served to essentialize and endanger Jewish persons, close brackets, and the election of 45 in the United States, the sense that the right were in the ascent all over was palpable. I meekly looked up the word mutation in the dictionary. Given the broad distribution and sale of my first book, Here Comes Trouble, an inquiry into art, magic, and madness as deviant knowledge, from here out, Here Comes Trouble, I drew great strength from the premise that material philosophy might be the critical genre with which to understand the predicaments we find ourselves in as a species. A genre, so it has been said, exists as a means to prepare us, the audience, for new structures of feelings, new sets of experiences. It is only to my great regret that the aspects of this work which draw on models of mutation today are of particular, somewhat morbid relevance, decades before I believed they would be.